All right, good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Let's go ahead and get this session started. I know we're pressed for time. And you guys may be just finishing up your break, but we need to go ahead and get through so we can get out of the way for the last presentation. My name's Charlie Johnson. I'm with the Office of the State Fire Marshal. I'm the Chief Fire Code Consultant. I've been asked to come and share with you this afternoon some of the changes that are coming into 2024 North Carolina Fire Code. There are many, many, many changes. What I'm going to share with you this afternoon is just a small sampling or a small fraction, if you will, of some of these changes. Hopefully, it'll get you some of the information that you were looking for. I want to start by giving you a little bit of background information as to where we are in the process. The code was adopted by the Building Code Council in the summer of 23 and ultimately approved by the Rules Review Commission in June of 24. And after that extensive process, we sent the code in a draft form to the International Code Council. They provided numerous comments, feedback on suggested edits and changes. We spent a considerable amount of time, made the modifications and edits, sent it back to them. And as a matter of fact, we're still waiting for ICC to provide the document to us so we can finalize the 2024 North Carolina Fire Code. It is, along with all the codes, are scheduled to become effective July 1st, 2025. But I must tell you, based on an amendment to House Bill 47 that was introduced yesterday, there may be a delay again in the effective dates of the codes. The Disaster Recovery Act, House Bill 47, ties it back to the appointments for the Building Code Council and the Residential Council. And until those positions are filled and those councils are in place, the way that amendment was written last night, that effective date could be extended 12 months beyond when those councils are in place. So as of today, July 1st, 2025 is the effective date, but stand by, it is subject to change based on legislative mandate, which would have significant impact on a lot of projects that folks have been potentially working on. So let me share with you a little bit some of the lead in. When I was asked to come and give this presentation, I've done 8 or 10 of these 6-hour presentations all across the state already, and was asked to consolidate this down to a 55-minute presentation. So we're going to scratch the surface on most of it's going to be related to fire protection, but I did include some stuff in here that I think may be beneficial and of interest to you guys. So we'll start some definition changes. There were quite a few new or modified definitions. There's some occupancy classification changes. There's a new A3 that are going to be greenhouses that are open for exhibition or display where the general public may be going in to look at those plants. You still will have the Group U classification if it's a legitimate greenhouse that's not for public access. There's also a modification. You'll see a couple highlights for the higher education labs under Group B. We'll talk about that. There's 4 new chapters that have been added to the 24 Fire Code. Chapter 38 is higher education laboratories. Chapter 39 is your plant extraction facilities, CBD, hemp, that sort of thing. Chapter 40, distilled spirits and wine storage. That's bulk storage of those products. And then there's a new chapter 12 also that deals specifically with energy storage systems. So there's 4 new chapters that we need to be familiar with. There's a modification on the Group B motor vehicle showrooms that includes the check-in areas. If you have an area where a vehicle is going to be brought in to do triage and they're going to move the vehicle to do repair somewhere else, that area is still going to be classified as part of the Group B. Energy storage in a dedicated use building will be an F1 occupancy. Your process and extraction facilities will be F1. Then you have 2 Group U classifications for small incidental communication buildings in those greenhouses. There's also 6 additional criteria that's added to 203 of the fire code as well as 307 of the building code that keeps a building from being classified as a Group H. Aerosol storage is one of them if they meet the requirements of Chapter 51. Stationary fuel cell and capacitor energy storage if they meet the Chapter 12 requirements. The Group B higher education labs. And then the last 2 are your distilling and brewing and storage of beverages, your distilled spirits and wine storage. So those will all remain how they're classified without being classified as Group H. We'll talk a little bit more about some of those as we get into the presentation. So some of the key changes related to fire protection, and this is a big one because current code Appendix B and Appendix D are only enforceable if adopted through local ordinance. The new code deletes those 2 appendices and embeds those requirements into Section 503 for access and 507 for water supply. Okay? The main reason for that was to provide consistent application across the state. With the local adoption at the local level, you had some jurisdictions enforcing those requirements and others were not. And it was creating a consistency issue. And so the committee's recommendation was to incorporate those requirements into Chapter 5. So let's start by looking at some of the new access requirements that will be a result of that. So the first one is we have 2 means of access now required for certain structures. So if I have a building that exceeds 3 stories or 30 feet in height, there'll be a requirement for 2 fire department access roads to access that building. If the building exceeds 62,000 square feet, also there's an exception that will allow that 62 to double to 124 if that building is protected by sprinklers. So a fully sprinklered building up to 124,000 square feet, you can still get by with 1 access route. If it's not sprinklered, anything over 62,000 is required to be accessed by 2 different routes. The multifamily residential, this one is, and I apologize for the inconsistency in the way it's worded, because the first bullet really is what's going to apply, because the requirement is multifamily with more than 100 dwelling units. But the first bullet says single access is allowed for up to 200 if they're sprinklered with a 13 or a 13R system, which commercial apartments newly built in North Carolina will be protected with a 13 or 13R. So you'd have to exceed 200 dwelling units before that access requirement is there for 2. And there is also a requirement for those 2 access routes to be remotely located, which simply means half the diagonal distance of the site. So if my development site is 1,500 feet from one corner to the other, those 2 roads have to be 750 feet apart. Okay? There is a session law, 2021-183, but that session law is only applicable to 1 and 2 family dwellings and townhome developments where those structures are built under the residential code. Okay? Now what that session law says is if I have a development with 150 homes and the owner and the developer determines it's technically infeasible to provide that 1/2 diagonal distance, then the fire code official has a choice. Either only require one way in and out or allow them to be closer together. But again, that's only for 1 and 2 families and townhomes. Remember, based on legislative action last year, 3 and 4 family dwellings, triplexes and quadplexes now are going to be allowed to be constructed under the residential code. So they're no longer built as a commercial building, they're built as residential code. Okay? Big change there is that eliminates the sprinkler requirement in 3 and 4 family dwellings that you currently have in the current code. There's also going to be new requirements for aerial apparatus access roads where the vertical distance between grade plane and the highest roof surface is over 30 feet. So if there's a requirement for aerial apparatus access, then that road width is going to increase from 20 feet wide to 26 feet wide. That aerial apparatus has to be at least 15 feet away from the face of one side of the building and no more than 30 feet. And there cannot be any overhead obstructions. So any utility, power lines, none of that can be within the designated area for the that's identified as the aerial apparatus access. So those are the requirements for access. Now related to needed fire flow. So when new buildings are constructed, we have to have a needed fire flow for the fire department to be able to extinguish a fire in that building based on construction type, size of the building, a lot of different parameters. Local jurisdiction generally is going to determine which methodology they're going to use to establish the needed fire flow. So there's the Appendix B method that's in our current code. There's an ISO method. There's NFPA 1142. There's a lot of different fire flow calculation methods that are employed across the state of North Carolina. So the way this new code is going to be written, we've pulled the tables into Section 507 from Appendix B. However, we left those options in there for local jurisdictions to utilize ISO or any of these other methods. So we're not just simply saying you have to meet the Appendix B fire flow criteria. We know that's not practical in the majority of the state of North Carolina. Fire flow requirements in a jurisdiction with 24-inch water mains and hydrants every 300 feet is much different than it is in rural North Carolina where your water supply systems don't exist. Okay, so there has to be a level of flexibility built into the code, but at the same time, we need some level of fire flow and available water supply for the fire department to be able to function. So the way the code's going to be written, you'll have a table. If a jurisdiction decides they're going to use the Appendix B criteria, this table will direct you to another table for calculating the fire flow. So if there's no automatic sprinkler system, top row, middle row is an NFPA 13 system, bottom row is an NFPA 13R system. Both 13 and 13R gives you a 25% reduction in not only the needed fire flow calculation, but the duration as well. So if I look at this table, and based on the size of the building and construction type, if I have a requirement for 2,000 gallons a minute for 2 hours, and I put an NFPA 13 system in that building, now my fire flow calculation is reduced to 25% of that number, which becomes 500 gallons a minute, not 2,000. But remember those two footnotes. So footnote A is going to tell you if it's an NFPA 13 system, regardless of the 25%, you still have to provide 1,000 gallons a minute. If it's a 13R, you still have to provide the 1,500 GPM. That's assuming they're using the table for that calculation. The code is also going to identify how to calculate the fire flow calculation area. And generally what we're talking about is what's within the footprint of the building or any additions or overhangs that could potentially be used for storage. Section 508, there's an amendment. The current code requires fire command centers be installed or provided in high-rise buildings. The new code is going to expand that requirement to F1 and S1 occupancies over 500,000 square feet. Okay? And there's a number of those that are under construction in North Carolina right now. So again, new code will require those fire command centers in those large open plan warehouses and factory industrial occupancies. Emergency responder communication coverage. I included this in the presentation, not because it was a code change that we recommended, but it was legislative action from Session Law 2024-49 that's going to require us to modify the 2024 code. So right now, if your building based on that exception 4 is less than 7,500 square feet, there's not a requirement to do an evaluation to determine if you have adequate radio communication for emergency responders. This session law is going to change that requirement to 12,000 square feet before that requirement is in place, as long as there's no below grade area. Okay? Fuel oil storage. Bob and those folks that were up here prior to me talked about the replacement of that generator. The new code is going to provide some options for installing tanks for fuel oil storage. The big change is, well, there's a couple of changes. One is we're specifically saying UL 80, 142, or 2085 are the listed tanks that are able to be used for a fire pump or diesel generator or whatever. The other significant change is the code is now going to allow the 660 gallons that's the limit now in a 142 tank to double to 1,320 gallons if the building is sprinkled. Okay? So if they put in a UL 142 tank in a sprinkler building, that 660 goes to 1,320. There's two parallel requirements that come along with that, though. Number one is that tank has to be in a 1 hour rated room now. So you're going to have 1 hour fire barrier that wraps that room unless the tank is UL 2085 listed. So a UL 2085 tank is 2 hour thermally protected. It has ballistic protection. It has vehicle impact protection. Doesn't make any sense to require added cost to build a 1 hour room when the tank is already protected to 2 hours. The second requirement is for spill control to be provided if the storage is over 60 gallons or an aggregate over 1,000, unless it's integral to the tank. So if you have listed secondary containment tanks, the spill control would not be required. All right, we'll spend the majority of the presentation looking at changes to Chapter 9 related to fire protection. I felt like that was probably what I could fit into the time frame. So I want to at least make you aware of some of these big ticket items that have made its way into the code. So the first change is in 901 related to acceptance testing or commissioning of new systems, if you will. So NFPA 4 is going to be a new standard that is going to be tied to integrated tested for high-rise buildings, and also if you have buildings equipped with fire alarm that also has smoke control systems, you'll have a test plan identified based on NFPA 4. So prior to CO and at 10-year intervals, you'll have to do this testing. If there's an equipment failure, you're only going to test whatever fails. You don't have to go back through the entire integrated testing. All right, let's look at some of the new triggers for new sprinkler installations. Some of these are huge when it comes to the new code. So first item, spaces under grandstands and bleachers. If either one of the following conditions exist, if the enclosed area is 1,000 square feet or less and not constructed in accordance with 1030-111, and I'll show you what that looks like in just a second, or the enclosed area exceeds 1,000 square feet. So 1030-111 comes from not only the fire code, but comes from chapter 10 building code as well, that requires those spaces to be protected with 1 hour fire resistance. But the exceptions say ticket booths less than 100 square feet, toilet rooms and other accessory use areas 1,000 square feet or less if equipped with sprinklers. So the intent behind this change in 903-2151 was to parallel this requirement in 1030. All right, Group E. The one I want to focus there, the highlighted language under the second trigger was modified. So the language, the trigger and the exception language was modified, but essentially it's the same requirement. What I want to focus on is the new item 3, or the new trigger number 3. The Group E fire area has an occupant load of 300 or more. So right now, current code, if I have an educational occupancy that exceeds 12,000 square feet in fire area, it requires sprinklers. This is a significant change because if you do the calculation for the density based on 20 square feet per occupant in a classroom, that's a 600 occupant load to get to the 12,000 people, or 12,000 square feet rather. This change is effectively going to say, if you have an educational occupancy that's over 6,000 square feet, it's going to drive a requirement for sprinklers. That's going to be a huge impact on a lot of daycare centers and a lot of small Group E occupancies in the state after the code becomes effective. It's not really going to have much impact on schools. Most of those have elected to sprinkle the buildings anyway. But that will be a huge impact on some daycare and other Group E occupancies. F1, distilled spirits. So the new code, if you're manufacturing distilled spirits, there's going to be a requirement for it to be sprinkled. Notice what it says, provided throughout the F1 fire area. There's no square footage trigger. There's no occupant load trigger. If your F1 manufacturing is over 1,000, if it's 500 square feet, it's going to drive a requirement to be sprinkled. Key thing to remember here, to be classified as F1, you're producing an alcohol with an alcoholic beverage content greater than 16%. Greater than 16. If it's 16 and under, it's going to be F2, and this requirement does not apply. Mercantile, upholstered furniture and mattresses. Current code's at 12,000 for mercantile occupancy. New code drops that to 5,000 if they're storing upholstered furniture and mattress. So if they're selling it in a mercantile arrangement, over 5,000 is going to drive a requirement for sprinklers. Emergency service sleeping areas. This section has needed some modification for quite some time. The change here is we not only, well, number one, we eliminated R2 because a fire station or an EMS facility could be R2 or R3 depending on the number of occupants. But we also added EMS buildings. So they still have a choice. They can use a 13D system, or they can use a limited area system as long as you can protect it with less than 6 sprinklers if you meet these following 3 criteria. So the building's not over 1 story, fire area is 2,500 or less, and it has 2 remote means of egress. Now, this highlighted box, I put this in there for reference because the 2024 International Building Code and 24 International Fire Code has been modified to provide some needed clarity. There's always been the question as to whether or not you treat a fire station as a transient or a non-transient facility. New code, not North Carolina, PAC, Yip and I, PAC's the chief code official, and my immediate boss, we've already had conversations about trying to pull that in as soon as we get the opportunity with the new council. So the new 2024 language has clarified that fire and EMS facilities are non-transient. And if there's more than 16, it's R2. If there's 16 and under, it's R3. So we think that will eliminate a lot of confusion for folks trying to design protection for these facilities. Along with the F1 requirement, there's also a requirement for S1, bulk storage. One of those new chapters I talked about earlier was chapter 40, specific chapter for the bulk storage, which is essentially going to be anything over 1.3 gallons. Okay? Again, regardless of square footage, there's no triggers for square footage, no triggers for occupant load. If it's S1, it's going to require sprinklers. The upholstered furniture and mattress, we discussed the mercantile. This requirement is for the storage of those in an S1 occupancy. 2,500 square feet is the trigger. There is an exception, though, if it's not greater than 1 story above grade plane and it's a self-service storage. So if you're dealing with the interior climate control facility, multi-story, over 2,500 square feet, new code is going to require it to be sprinkled. All right, big change coming to North Carolina. One of the big changes. Current code really doesn't have, unless you exceed height and area limitations, a threshold requirement to sprinkle open parking garages. New code, if it's over 48,000 square feet, the open parking garage is going to require sprinklers. There is an exception that was approved by the committee to incentivize 1A construction for open parking garages that will eliminate that requirement if it is 1A. But any other parking structure, open parking garage, will require sprinkler if it's over 48,000. And some of that is lessons learned from significant parking deck fires in not only here in the country, but overseas as well. So if you get an opportunity, sometimes just Google UK parking deck fires. I pulled the pictures from both of them. One of those parking decks, we lost 1,300 vehicles. The other one, 1,700 vehicles consumed in the deck. And the bottom picture, you can see what it done to the concrete structure. So the accelerated burning rate, the flame propagation from one vehicle to the next, and as larger vehicles and the EV component being added to it, these are accelerated fires that are burning in these parking decks. That's the reason for this requirement. There's also going to be a requirement if it's a mechanical access parking garage. Again, no trigger on size. If it's mechanical access, going to have a requirement for sprinklers. All right, let's look at some of the changes specific to the various standards, 1313R primarily. So this change, if you look in the current code, in Group R occupancies other than R4, you're not required to sprinkle bathrooms that are less than 500 square feet, or 55 square feet. The new code is going to include R4 in that option. So if you have assisted living facilities, congregate care facilities, alcohol treatment, some of these that may be protected with an NFPA 13 system. If the bathrooms are less than 55 square feet, you can omit sprinkler protection in those bathrooms. All right, here's another big one. Under the current code, you can build 4-story on top of a pedestal or podium and protect it with a 13R sprinkler system. If the building doesn't exceed 60 feet in height, that goes away in the new code. The allowance for a 13R system, 4 stories, is measured from grade plane. So if you're going to build 2-story podium and put residential on top of it, the 2-story podium counts as your first 2 stories. So you can go 2 stories above that podium, as long as you don't exceed 4 stories, and protect it with a 13R. You put 3 stories on top of that podium, now you're going to put a 13 system in that building. Significant change based on where we're at in the code now. There's a lot of buildings out there that have been built with 13R systems on top of pedestal or podium buildings and have created some high challenge fires for the fire department because a lot of those areas are not protected. That change is significant in the new code. Another change in the new code related to 13R systems is where the code gives you the option for type 3, 4, or 5 construction. So you can build these, say an apartment building with type 3, 4, or 5. The new code is going to say you can build that balcony or deck with 5B construction, but it has to be protected. Okay? So the highlighted change there is what's new. It's intended to parallel the requirement in Chapter 7 of the Building Code. Some more 13R changes. So number 4, if I have open-ended corridors in a 13R building, I have to sprinkle that corridor based on 1027.6. The new code is also going to require sprinklers if I meet any one of these other 4 options. Combustible finish, walls, floors, whatever. That corridor is going to get sprinkled. Change in direction, more than 45 degrees. Less than 50% open to the outside air. Or if you have egress balconies that are not open in accordance with 1021. We also have some changes related to 13R as it involves attic sprinkler protection. So attic sprinkler protection is going to be required if any of these conditions are met. Number 1, if we're going to use the attic for storage, the standard doesn't require sprinklers, but the code now will require that attic to be sprinkled. Where fuel-fired equipment is installed in the attic, you don't have to have sprinklers throughout, but you'll have to install one above the equipment for cooling. Back to those type 3, 4, and 5 construction that references back to the 510 and the pedestal buildings in the building code. Attics that are not required by item 1. In other words, we're not using them for storage. We have to sprinkle them if the roof assembly is more than 55 feet above lowest level of fire department access. But the code's going to give you an option. So either you sprinkler it, you construct it using non-combustible material, you use FRT, complying with 23 of the building code, or you fill the attic with non-combustible insulation. And when you're measuring that 55 feet, it's going to be to the highest, or excuse me, yes, whatever yields the greatest distance of those 3. The eave of the highest pitch roof, intersection of the highest roof to the exterior wall, or the top of the highest parapet. Whichever one of those 3 yields the highest distance will determine when sprinklers are required. You also have a similar requirement in R4 condition 2 occupancies. Again, if the attic's not going to be used for storage, we have 5 protection options now. The 4 of them are identical to what we just talked about. The only one that's different is the heat detection. The only reason we're requiring this is because of the condition 2. The occupants in that R4 occupancy are going to require some level of custodial care, which is going to delay their ability to get out of that building. That's the reason for the added protection. Change here was to clarify when sprinklers are going to be required for obstructions. We've always had the requirement that if you have an obstruction that exceeds 4 feet in width, then you have to sprinkle underneath it. Garage doors, HVAC duct, whatever. This change simply says, in addition to that, you also have to evaluate the applicable standard that the building is protected under. So the example that I gave you is from Chapter 8 out of NFPA 13. Open grate flooring now, even if it's open, if it's more than 4 feet in width, Chapter 8 of NFPA 13 requires sprinklers underneath that. So that was the reason why this change was necessary in 903.33. (904.12), new section specifically for aerosol fire extinguishing systems that you may start seeing in some locations. If you do, then the requirements in NFPA 2010 are going to be applicable. Two changes to the commercial cooking requirements. For the first time ever, the fire code is going to reference NFPA 96. It's always been referenced in the mechanical code, but now the fire code will reference that for more than one reason, and we'll talk about a couple of those in a little bit. The other change is to pull in a reference to NFPA 750 for the automatic water mist systems that are used a lot in the food prep, commercial food prep operations. We modified section 904.13. Current code says if I have a manual release for that automatic suppression system, that it has to be 10 feet at least and no more than 20 feet. The problem was that 10 feet was problematic. So we changed this to retain the 20 from the max, but we eliminated the 10. The other reason for that is we have UL listed equipment that has the pull station where? On the equipment. So you couldn't meet the 10-foot setback requirement, and we had issues from vendors saying 10 feet was problematic in some of these smaller kitchen applications. So we made that modification. 904.14 is going to parallel 3 sections in the building code, chapter 4, for your I-1, I-2, and R2 college dormitories. So what those sections are going to require in the new code is cooktops and ranges have to be protected in those 3 applications. And 904.14 of the fire code is going to provide you those 2 protection options. One is you can put a UL 300A suppression system within the range hood, or you can use the UL 858 listed burners that are manufactured for the express purpose of shutting down automatically when you get to a certain temp. So that'll be a design option, either or. Code gives them that authority. Standpipes. The change here, the significant change here, is the code's going away from requiring the standpipe hose outlet at the intermediate floor level. New code's going to require it at the main floor landing. There's changes to the 906 related to fire extinguishers. Not going to go through this in a whole lot of detail, but number 2 basically is going to allow schools to eliminate fire extinguishers in those common use areas if they put one in every classroom. So if you think they're going to go from 8 or 10 in a school building to 40 or 50, one in every class, raise your hand if you think that's going to happen. It's not going to happen. The other option is for Group S occupancies where the occupant is primarily someone on a lift truck. We're going to eliminate the requirement to have fire extinguishers scattered throughout the building as long as they're provided on the lift truck for that employee, assuming there's not other occupants in the building. We also made some changes to address the domestic cooking that we just talked about. There still will be requirements for portable fire extinguishers, whether they choose the suppression or the ignition prevention burners. There'll also be an exception for fire extinguishers in normally unmanned Group U buildings, as long as the service equipment truck that goes there has fire extinguisher on it. This change is really just relocating your fire extinguisher requirements from 904 for solid fuel and deep fryers to 906. All it is a shift in location. The technical change is not there. The 2021 International Code eliminated manual and automatic fire alarm detection for R4 occupancies. But because North Carolina DHHS has a requirement that adult and child care in R4 are to be equipped with a fire alarm system, we had to relocate this section from 907-210 to 907-224. The only other thing we done was change and remove the residential listing. There's a requirement in the new code for your Group S self-storage, 3 or more stories. There will be a requirement to have fire alarm installed in those. The code's finally catching up to the standard as it relates to the 520 low frequency signaling in your R1 and 2 occupancies. So the code's going to give you the option to use as part of an integral notification in the detector or the use of a sounder base, either one. There's a new section 90710 to require smoke alarms to be tested and maintained and replaced when they fail to respond to these tests or when they exceed 10 years from the date of manufacture. So any facility that has smoke alarms now will be required to perform these tests and document those. Fire pumps in 913, the change here is simply saying if you have a sprinkler system installed as a 13D or a P2904 from the residential code, that pump does not have to meet NFPA 20 as long as it's listed for that residential use. Okay? They also modified 913 regarding the thermal protection required for your fire pump electrical circuits. We already have the 2196 listed cable. These changes add 3 more options. (915), we modified the carbon monoxide detection requirements to recognize the requirement in the statute, and also if the existing building code requires it based on renovation, alteration, or whatever. Another significant change, current code doesn't require carbon monoxide in I3 occupancies, but the new code will. There's a new section 916 for gas detection systems. And this section is simply going to contain the requirements, but it's really going to be pointed to from other parts of the code. So as an example, plant extraction facilities. There'll be a section in Chapter 39 that will require gas detection in accordance with 916. Mass notification alert systems for college and university campuses. If the cumulative occupant loads over 1,000 people, the new code is going to require a registered design professional to do an analysis based on NFPA 72 to determine the need. If that analysis determines there's a need, then a system will be required. Most of these probably already have something in place. New Chapter 12, not going to expand too much on this. We did move some requirements for emergency and standby power that's in 604 now to the new 1203, and all the solar photovoltaic requirements that's in 605 have moved to 1205, but this is a brand new chapter that deals with all the new energy storage system configurations that we're seeing coming into the state. Chapter 33, buildings under construction, went through several major modifications. And I'm going to skim through these pretty quickly for the sake of time. But a couple of the key components: if you're building a new building, a site safety plan must be developed and will be required to be submitted to the fire code official prior to the start of construction. The model code language, the requirement was that that be submitted prior to the permit being issued. North Carolina modified that language, unfortunately. Because what's going to happen now, they're going to walk out the door and get a permit, start construction on the project. How many of them you going to think are going to say, oh, by the way, we forgot to submit that plan, let's go take care of that? Which is going to end up being local fire code officials going to come out, if they're going vertical on that building and have started construction without that plan, stop work order is going to be issued. That's the environment that this has created. The other change is there's going to be a requirement for a site safety director, and more importantly, there's going to be a requirement for daily site safety inspections for the duration of that project until the CO is issued. So I'm sure some of you are familiar with the new mass timber requirements that are coming in North Carolina. As part of our new code, we're going to have 3 new construction types: 4A, 4B, and 4C. So we've had to modify the requirements for these buildings under construction because they're at a vulnerable state until the build out occurs. When the building is finished, we've got safety systems in place, we've got fire protection in place, we can protect the buildings. Until we get to that point, though, these buildings are somewhat dangerous. So as you can see, based on what we're going to see come into the new code, just as an example, if I build a mass timber 4A construction, I can build a 20-story Group B occupancy with mass timber. I can build 18-story R2 apartment buildings, mass timber. We modified the fire watch requirements for demolition and new construction. We modified the water supply requirements. We talked earlier about your needed fire flow, and once you calculate that needed fire flow, this section is going to identify what that minimum requirement is going to be during the course of that construction. And based on the exposure separation distance, essentially how far are you from the property line will determine how much or what percentage of that needed fire flow you're going to have to provide. Picture on the bottom right is the South Park fire in Charlotte, May of 2023, where we lost 2 construction workers and almost lost 10 firefighters that day. The Chapter 38, higher education labs, the premise behind this, and again, this is only higher education labs. This is your college and university campuses. The idea behind this is right now the code is somewhat restrictive when you look at maximum allowable quantities per control area for hazardous materials. The new code is going to incorporate some limitations based on density within a particular control area or laboratory suite. Bottom line, new code is going to allow you to exceed the current MAQs while still classifying these buildings as Group B. Okay? But you'll be controlled by how much you can have based on the design and construction of that lab suite or that control area. Another change that's been needed, it's been common practice to do this, but if I have a building from a hazardous material standpoint, I'm limited to 4 control areas on the ground floor of that building. The common practice has always been if I subdivide that building with a true firewall based on Chapter 7 of the building code, then I can create essentially 2 separate buildings and have 4 control areas in each one of those buildings. This language has been incorporated into Chapter 50 of the Fire Code as well as Chapter 3 of the Building Code that will now clarify that if you put this firewall in, you can essentially add the number of control areas on the other side of that rated assembly. You're still going to have your 1-hour fire barriers separating each separate control area, but that clarifies that. Last slide, this has always been somewhat controversial because the medical gas community, changes were made. If you see what's in the highlight, the code before referred to inhalation, sedation, all these dentistry, all of these different uses. It didn't specifically say ambulatory care, so somebody called the question on it. So they modified the section to essentially say, if you're using medical gas for patient or veterinary care, this section applies. Okay? They also, as part of the 2024 building code, there's a new section 427 added that will parallel the requirements in the fire code in the building code. And I'll leave you with the last 2 things that were really technical changes here is the size of the ventilation openings changed from 24 square inches to 36 for each 1,000 cubic feet of gas. And then the last change, there's 3 options in this section. You can use a 1-hour exterior room, 1-hour interior room, or gas cabinets. If you use the 1-hour interior-exterior room, your supply and exhaust has to be in a 1-hour shaft to the outside of the building. This change says if you're going to use a cabinet to satisfy the intent behind this section, that same requirement applies for the cabinet. So your supply and exhaust duct to the exterior will be in a 1-hour shaft from the cabinet, just like it will be the rooms. And I know we're winding down on time. I apologize for not having time for questions. Again, reach out if you have questions. Charlie Johnson, Office of State Fire Marshal. You can find my contact information on the website. If I can ever help you or answer questions, feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.